Bali now, where the world's attention is on that high-stakes meeting between President Biden and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping. They met face-to-face as presidents of their respective countries for the first time. Their bilateral meeting beginning with a friendly handshake, followed by talks that aimed at finding a way out of the frosty relationship between Washington and Beijing and propelling it onto a more positive path.
Committed to keeping the lines of communications open between you and me personally, but our governments across the board, because our two countries have so much that we have an opportunity to deal with.
The current situation that China-US relationship is facing is a concern for all of us. The situation is not in line with the interest of the people of our two countries, nor does it satisfy the expectations of the international society.
Now, those talks between the two leaders lasted almost exactly 3 hours and ended within the last half an hour or so. Earlier in the day, Biden and Xi arrived in Bali for the G20 Summit, which of course begins on Tuesday. But today was set aside for their meeting. And China was saying ahead of the meeting that it hoped to bring relations back on track with the US at the summit, while Biden told Asian leaders in Cambodia over the weekend that America's communication lines with China will stay open to prevent conflict. Both leaders talked of seeking to manage competition responsibly and work together where their interests align. But from the chip market to Ukraine, Taiwan and human rights, divisions have only deepened in the last year. President Xi's government on multiple occasions has criticised the Biden administration's posture towards self-ruled Taiwan, which Beijing considers its own territory. It views US recent action in the region as undermining China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Biden and Xi have held 5 calls since Biden became US president in January of 2021. The last time they met face-to-face was during the Obama presidency, when Joe Biden, of course, was vice president. So for more on how this meeting went, I'm joined now by WION's principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal. He is live for us from Bali. And Siddhant, I'm seeing a White House readout of this meeting that says the two leaders spoke candidly about their respective priorities and intentions across a range of issues. What else do we know about how this meeting went?
Well, the meeting, of course, lasted for considerable time, and from the White House readout, which is considerably long, it looks like that it's a positive meeting. In fact, the last line of that readout says that the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken will be traveling to China for the follow-up of the conversations that happened here in Bali. So that's a significant development. The United States sending the Secretary of State to Beijing. That shows that there is some kind of easing of the thorny issues, or perhaps the tiff that had happened between Washington and Beijing, especially after the Taiwan Strait crisis, where we saw both sides coming up with strong rhetoric. But by and large, today's meeting could essentially go a long way in terms of pacifying or easing the tensions between the world's #1 and #2 economy. There were many issues, Taiwan issue, trade issues. In fact, the readout also mentions about trading issues. The US president also raised issues like Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, of course, naturally, and of course the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That all has been mentioned in the readout. But now the big focus is on the presser by the US president shortly happening here in Bali.
Siddhant, it's worth making the point that in that readout, the Americans say that President Biden and President Xi reiterated their agreement that a nuclear war should never be fought and can never be won, and underscored their opposition to the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. That is the Americans driving at least a small wedge between Beijing and Moscow, right?
Well, yes, of course, and this is a message straight to Moscow, that too by Washington and Beijing, and perhaps the sharpest criticism, to use the phrase, from Beijing of the rhetoric coming from Moscow by the Russian President Vladimir Putin regarding the usage of nuclear weapons. So that clearly shows that Beijing is also not very happy, given that the rhetoric and of course the commentary coming from the Russian president. And remember, Beijing and Russia, Moscow have good relationships, so much so the phrase was used as the limitless partnership. That limitless partnership looks like is heading towards some limits, and these comments are something that Moscow surely will be carefully reading.
And just finally and briefly, Siddhant, you pointed out that sort of the key deliverable coming out of this meeting appears to be this agreement that Secretary of State Antony Blinken will visit China to follow up on the discussions. I mean, assuming that that outcome was not necessarily pre-cooked, and it may have been, what should we read into that? I mean, that they are at least agreeing that dialogue is the continuing way to go?
The fact that both the sides are willing to talk, and also the visit of a high-level official from Washington to Beijing, is a very positive outcome, given just few months ago or perhaps weeks ago there were shrilling comments coming from both sides, and it looked like the relationship is going towards some kind of disaster, but that, it looks like, is not happening as of now. And Bali could be seen as a major success in bringing back the relationship to a normalcy that was, of course, being also talked about. In fact, a lot of conciliatory comments were coming from the American side by the US president, who said that the competition should not lead to conflict, and also talked about certain red lines. But clearly there has been a candid conversation between the leaders of US and, of course, China.
Siddhant Sibal, WION's principal diplomatic correspondent, joining us live from Bali. And stay with WION, of course, for more dispatches from Siddhant as the G20 summit gets underway on Tuesday.